Welcome back to the Elevate Your Running podcast. I'm here with Claire Shorenstein. Claire, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Sarah. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks so much for being here. You are a registered dietitian, and we're here to talk all about iron and ferritin today. And before we get into that conversation, I'd love for you to give our audience an introduction to who you are and what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so as you said, I'm a registered dietitian. I'm board certified in sports dietetics, so otherwise known as a sports dietitian. And I am also a longtime runner myself, distance runner, was more in the trails these days and was dabbling in ultras and all that stuff for a while. Currently nursing an injury, so less running, more swimming and biking, but it's all good. But yeah, I've been working with teenage and adult athletes for over a decade now, of all abilities on their nutrition. My specialty and the most fun thing I love is working with kind of everyday recreational athletes. And, many of them are very, very competitive still, but they're really juggling all the crazy things of life, right? So maybe they have kids or they're working, they're doing all these different things, they're training, and they're trying to figure out how to fuel themselves appropriately, which is always the challenge, right? So, these people have a lot of goals and a lot of things they're trying to accomplish. And so it's really just trying to figure out how can we do all of this at once. Often we can't do it all at once and we have to kind of make some changes, but it's a really fun problem solving situation that I get into with a lot of people. And it really describes me too. Like that's what I am. I am a everyday athlete and mom of two. I have my own small business. My practice is called Eat for Endurance. It's a virtual private practice. So I'm juggling all the things. I know how it feels. I know how it is to be training for like a really big event and doing all the things and trying to fuel myself well. So yeah. And the last thing I'll mention is I have a podcast myself called the Eat for Endurance podcast that I've had for about 5 years, where I interview a variety of different athletes and here are kind of, we learn their nutrition story. You of course were just on my podcast and I also interview my colleagues, my sports dietitian colleagues on a variety of nutrition topics. And it's a lot of fun.
Oh my gosh, I can tell how much fun you have. Like the passion, you're so passionate about like what you do. And I think it's such a great place to be, especially in this space, doing what you love. You're an athlete and you're also helping athletes become stronger with their fueling. What's kind of the number one thing before we dive into this week's topic? What's
Yeah.
like the number one thing that you see from the people that you work with? And this is going to be outside of like trying to do it all. Like, what would be like the
Mm-hmm.
one thing that's kind of standing out to you?
In terms of like a problem that they have, you mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd say that being consistent with nutrition, which kind of falls into the bucket of under fueling, and a lot of the times it can be unintentional. Sometimes it's intentional, but I just see a lot of people who are really prioritizing their training, and again, they have these goals. They really love whatever sport they're doing, or with a ton of runners and triathletes and cyclists and whatnot. But then they're just not quite getting enough in. And that can be because, they're training in the morning and then they're rushing out the door and dealing with their children or getting to work or whatever. And they just haven't planned ahead, or they think they're getting enough in and they're just not because their demands are so high. So yeah, I think just getting enough nutrition in and figuring out like how to appropriately like plan and prepare to make it all happen. Because sometimes I get people who like, I know what to do, I just can't make it happen. So
Yeah.
yeah, that would be it.
Yeah. Do you work with them on strategies on how to make
Oh
it
yeah,
happen? Oh, that's great.
absolutely. So, we're talking about, yeah, well, okay, what can we get done? I mean, literally yesterday I was talking to somebody about, her mornings are crazy and it takes forever for her to eat breakfast because she's doing all these different things. And we're kind of going through, okay, well, what can we remove from your morning to make it go more smoothly? Like, what can we do the day before? Like, how can we remove because she's a little bit more of a perfectionist. So, okay, how can we like figure out, like, runners and type A, like, never happens, right? Like, how can we set more reasonable expectations and like just manage those expectations and more realistic goals for ourselves, so we like get out the door and make these things happen. And I think a lot of times it's also really helping people see that, you know, exercise and nutrition just go hand in hand, and you cannot prioritize one without prioritizing the other. And we always see that, right? I have to get my training in, but I ran out of time. I can't eat this meal, you know? So it's really just making sure those things are really going together and coming up with easy strategies or easier things, rather than like getting too attached to like the perfect choice or the ideal choice. Cause sometimes we just don't have that luxury of like, what's that thing that's going to be the most delicious and wonderful and amazing? Like, okay, you know what? Sometimes we just have to grab a convenience option or whatever's around and make it happen. So something is better than nothing. And then we can kind of continue to work on it. So it's just kind of figuring out what are those like easy first steps we can take, and then building upon that to make it better.
Yeah, that sounds so approachable. And like once you kind of dial it down, you can build it up and make it
Mm-hmm.
into something really, really incredible. And I know from experience that like once you start to fuel appropriately, you feel the difference. And then you want to
Mm-hmm.
hang on to like that
Yes.
feeling of strength and energy and avoiding the 3 p.m. crash. So,
Mm-hmm. Totally.
yeah.
Totally. I get some people who are like, oh, I don't really eat breakfast. I'm not hungry. You know, and I'm like, well, let's explore that. And then a lot of the time, it's like by the end of us working together, like, I can't imagine not eating breakfast. I get so hungry if I don't eat breakfast. I'm like, yep.
Oh, yeah, that's
So,
so great. I love that so much. And I think a lot of us can relate to all of that. So, thanks for that little side part to the
mm-hmm.
podcast. But we're going to dive into today's topic, which is all about ferritin and iron levels. And I'm such a big believer in making sure that these areas within your blood panels and the biomarkers are as strong as possible, because I am an endurance female athlete who lives at altitude. So I have everything working against me.
Mm-hmm.
It
Yeah.
feels like to have these areas at a level that will support my training. And it's been something that I've gone through over the years of having low levels and having to work through that. And then, of course, as my training has changed over the years, like how does everything change on top of training in terms of nutrition and making sure that all of your biomarkers are staying where they need to stay, kind of in that green zone. So let's kick it off. I want to talk first about, maybe you can help explain like what's the difference between iron and ferritin and why are they so important for runners?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So, just to kind of keep it basic, iron is a mineral that is present in red blood cells. So it's part of a protein called hemoglobin. That's another marker that we look at. It's part of your complete blood count, or CBC. And hemoglobin, it carries oxygen from the lungs to the body's tissues and organs. So that's obviously an important one for anyone who's alive and also exercising. And of course, iron plays a number of other really important roles in the body. It's including, you know, energy metabolism and immune function and cognitive function and many more things. So again, all essential stuff for athletic performance and overall health.
Yeah.
Ferritin, by contrast, is a protein that stores iron and releases it when the body needs it. So in other words, it's just the storage form of iron. And so when we think about what it all means with, like, in terms of our blood work, because people always get blood work done and kind of be like, okay, what does this all mean? So serum iron is measuring the amount of iron in your blood, and this level can fluctuate a bit day to day. Ferritin, again, that storage form, it's a little bit of a better, more steady indicator of your iron status, although it is worth noting that ferritin is what's known as an acute phase reactant protein, meaning that its levels are influenced by inflammation. So it can be, ferritin can be falsely elevated. So you don't want to get too excited when you see a really high ferritin when, like, say you're sick, or let's say you get tested. So you do want to be careful about when you test ferritin, is the messaging here. But you know, let's say, yeah, you're sick, or maybe you just did like a long or hard workout within 48 hours, or if you just did like a marathon or another like hard race, if you're overtrained, these are all things that can influence ferritin, make it falsely elevated, and really doesn't give you a good picture of like what your baseline is. So that's just something we really want to keep in mind. And, you know, when we think about iron deficiency, I think it's also important to kind of define a few of these things just while we're like laying the groundwork.
Yeah.
We're talking about reduced red blood cell production due to the fact that there isn't enough iron available in the body. And that low ferritin is not the same thing as iron deficiency anemia. So we really only have an anemia when, your ferritin is low. So that storage is depleted, and we see your hemoglobin and hematocrit, which is again is part of what we call a CBC or complete blood count. That's what you would order from the lab. When those things are also low, that's what you have like a true anemia, versus like more of a depletion when your ferritin is low, maybe your iron's a little low, but everything else is normal. And the reason why I want to flag this is because, if someone were to go to get their blood work done with a doctor, and you don't order like an iron panel and you don't order a ferritin, but you just order, say, a CBC, and we see those are normal, and you're an endurance athlete, and let's say you are at altitude or whatever, and maybe you're feeling kind of like garbage and you're not sure why, and then your doctor looks at it and say, oh, everything looks good, and you're like, what's wrong with me? So it really is a good idea to kind of get this whole clinical picture of what's going on, so you can get a better sense of what your iron status is. And we might even order like what's called like a CRP, a C-reactive protein, to get a better sense of inflammation, to see if that's influencing things. So that's like all of that. I just want to kind of lay the groundwork there. And in terms of, why is it important for runners? Well, obviously runners are putting a lot of demands on their body, right? Especially if you're training
Yeah.
for an endurance event. So you are going to be at a higher risk for developing iron deficiency, and especially if you are a female athlete, and especially if you're at altitude. So we think about, okay, well, what are runners doing? Well, they're exercising. Exercise is, of course, increasing your energy demands. As I just mentioned earlier, a lot of the people I see in the endurance setting are really not meeting their energy demands. And even if you are getting the iron that you need through the diet, let's say, you may or may not be absorbing it or utilizing it in the way you are, getting into the storage form. We also see with runners, slightly increased losses through the GI system, through sweat, through what's called foot strike hemolysis. You're breaking down red blood cells in the feet. It's not like a huge amount, but it's a little bit more.
Yeah.
And then one last thing I'll say is the stress on the body can sometimes create some more inflammation in the gut lining, which again can kind of interfere a little bit with some absorption and utilization of many different micronutrients, because iron is not just about iron itself. It's like all these other micronutrients play a really important role in iron metabolism and storage. So we have to kind of keep those things in mind. So all to say that iron is a really important and also really tricky thing for people to figure out sometimes. And it involves a lot of detective work.
It sounds like it. So, for our audience listening, are you getting the sense that maybe out of all the things that Claire just mentioned, there's a lot going on here,
Yeah, a
right?
lot going on.
That we all probably have a low ferritin and a low iron count.
Not necessarily, but it's common. It's common. Not necessarily,
Yeah.
though. We got to get it checked.
Yeah, for sure. It is common. And that was one of the reasons why when we connected, I wanted to have this conversation with you to normalize it, but also educate on what we can do to show up a little bit stronger in this area. So what are considered normal levels of both of these biomarkers?
Yeah. So for iron, and these levels will vary from like lab to lab, but like I just looked at, because I just got my labs tested, so I just looked it up, and the range is 35 to 150 micrograms per deciliter. You really don't want to be high in iron. So iron is one of these things that it can be it's toxic if it's really high. It can be dangerous. And as I said, these levels can fluctuate in the blood. Ferritin, it's a really interesting one, because what's considered normal, quote unquote normal, I mean, this range is huge. It's so broad. Again, I looked at my lab. It's 12 to 252. And what's normal is not optimal. So that's often what we hear, like when it comes
Yes.
to like whether it's vitamin D or like whatever, lots of things that we talk about, that what's quote unquote normal is not optimal, and especially for endurance athletes. And ferritin is a really great example of that, because I've had a lot of clients, and I know my colleagues, I hear this all the time, where again, a physician who may not be like a sports informed physician will see a ferritin of 15 or 18 or whatever it is and be like, oh, that's fine, you're good. And it's like, no, you're not good. You're not good at all. That's really not a good thing. And yes, of course, we want to make sure that we want to check in with a person and check in, are they having symptoms, right? It is important to really look at the entire clinical person, the whole athlete. Sometimes we occasionally do get people who maybe have a lower ferritin and are not symptomatic. Usually I would say if your ferritin is less than 20, you're normally feeling that. Like, you're probably not going to be performing as well or recovering as well. You're probably experiencing fatigue and some other issues. But yeah, so I think, again, just really emphasizing what's normal is not necessarily where you want to be, and you do want to treat that.
Absolutely. And I've heard those stories too about getting blood work back and having a doctor check
Mm-hmm.
off and sign off on it when it's
Mm-hmm.
really, as an endurance athlete, maybe they're training at altitude, maybe not, but like it's actually too low for that athlete and there are adjustments that need to be made. So it's good to know that you can also advocate for yourself and do a little bit more outside of just getting a normal blood panel drawn and getting results from your primary care doctor.
Yeah, and so for endurance athletes, I definitely would recommend at least 40 to 50 is kind of the goal. If you're
Mhm.
altitude, definitely on that higher end, maybe even higher than 50. But this is really an individual thing as well. Like, you might experience, like if you are in the habit of checking your ferritin on a regular basis, and I really would recommend that you get lab work done at least once a year. And if you have
Mhm.
history of any iron issues, more than that. But kind of taking notes on, okay, well, how do I feel when my ferritin is at this level, and how does it feel when I'm at that level? And you might notice differences, and also how your body responds. Like, if you are treating it, like, how can you get it up and what's going on there? Um, we throw these kind of generalized things out there, but it's important to kind of keep tabs on what feels good to you as well.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that answer of it depends, right?
Yeah.
Because each person's going to be different and have a different
Yeah.
scenario and situation.
Hmm.
And it is important to stay on top of it. And I had blood work and tests done through Inside Tracker for years, and I found that to be really beneficial because they host all of your history of blood work. You can
Yeah.
see what's red, yellow, green, and being kind of in that it's great data to keep track of. For runners who are training year round, maybe they run a marathon a year, they have a half marathon, and the second half of the year they have a block of speed. So they're training almost year round or maybe the entire year. When is the best time for that athlete to take a test?
Yeah, maybe. Well, so first it depends on like what you're trying to accomplish. If you're just trying to get like baseline levels and not be like, what happens to my body when I really like try to kill myself in a race, like
I
that's a
have done
different thing.
that.
Yeah. I'm curious what happens when yeah, not that. When we're talking about like, I just want to know what my baseline is and what I need to work on.
Mhm.
Probably at the beginning of a training cycle when you're base building.
Yep.
So it's been at least a couple of weeks since you've done a really hard effort. Maybe you had a rest day and or some easy days, leading up. So again, nothing crazy or hard. Not when you're sick, just trying to catch it. It's tricky because you have to make the appointment well in advance, and it has to be early in the morning, and maybe you're fasting. It's like this whole thing, but it's worth it. It's worth doing. So yeah, I'd probably say that's a good time.
Yeah, I love that time frame, and it is absolutely a great thing to get done. It is, I would say, a little bit inconvenient, like fasting, and not, for me, it's like not having coffee. But then,
Oh
like,
yeah,
I like literally bring coffee with me. It's just like sitting in my car waiting for me when I
same.
get back to my car. Um, but I think it's like it's so satisfying to know when you get the results back where you land, and then what you can improve on or where things kind of shake out for you. And I had to laugh because I was working with Inside Tracker for a few years, and I actually did take a test for them with them, like 2 days after running my third marathon. It was the Mesa Marathon, and it was a really warm marathon. So I was also like dehydrated. And when the lady was, she was taking my blood, she asked me if I was out partying the night before. I said, no, but I ran a marathon 2 days ago. And she's like, wow. Like, and needless to say, like the results came back. I mean, I'm sure you know what they were. They were terrible. I mean, everything was just like so skewed and
Out of
off,
whack. Yeah. Yeah.
out of whack. Yeah. But it was really interesting to do. So for an athlete who may be saying to themselves now, like, well, I do feel kind of fatigued in training, or I maybe this is something I need to be concerned about. What are more of the red flags that are associated around having a low iron count or a high iron count, right? Because we don't want that either.
Mm-hmm.
And then, a low ferritin storage level.
Yeah. So some of the traditional symptoms that we associate with iron depletion and especially anemia. So again, just to specify, like a depletion is like your iron is low, but the other things are kind of normal. And then anemia is again when you're really truly everything's low because the hemoglobin hematocrit has to go down. So yeah, fatigue, we might see like headaches, poor recovery, or maybe you're not adapting to your training, heavy legs, decreased endurance or aerobic capacity. You can have pale skin, or maybe that's your baseline because it's winter right now. I don't know. I think essentially you're just feeling like garbage and you're
Yeah.
struggling to do your training, right? You're feeling off. Things aren't feeling right. And with high iron, unfortunately, a lot of it is the same. So it's a
Yeah.
lot of like similar symptoms. So you are seeing like fatigue, you're seeing hair loss. I mean, you can have like heart issues, and there's some other things like joint pain and stuff. But I will say that typically we're seeing more commonly lower iron, lower ferritin. I don't frequently or as frequently see like high iron ferritin. Like maybe I'll see high iron if someone's been supplementing, like over supplementing, because sometimes what happens is someone sees a low ferritin, their iron's normal, and so maybe it's more of a just an issue of like, hey, you're not getting iron into like where it needs to go into storage form. So that's where those all those other micronutrients come into play. Or maybe it's like something with the gut. And and because they don't really understand what's going on, or maybe the doctor doesn't understand, they're like, oh, just take an iron supplement. But you really shouldn't, because your iron's already borderline high or doesn't need, so it can like drive that up, and that can cause problems. And then the other thing is more of a genetic issue, hemochromatosis, where your body's just kind of hanging on to more iron. So yeah, that's where that is headed. I think, was there another part to that question? I forget. I think I covered it.
Yeah, and are are those red flags apparent for both male and female
Mm,
runners? Like, does
yes.
everyone experience those? Okay.
Yeah, so the symptoms will be the same as far as I'm aware between men and women, but we do see it more commonly in women
Mhm.
because of menstruation. So you're obviously like blood contains iron, so you're losing blood there. Pregnancy, we can see some issues there. So women are more likely to experience iron deficiency, and their symptoms are often more severe. So we just see a little bit more in women, but I have worked with many men with iron deficiency as well. So men, you also need to be on top of this. And then, especially when we think about like how are you eating, nutrition habits and other things that are, affecting this.
Yeah, so there's like a lot that can go into making this all be what it is. So
Mm-hmm.
how does a runner decide then, well, I am kind of feeling like garbage, but maybe they
Mm-hmm.
have some stress going on in life. Maybe the workouts are a little bit too hard for where they're at, but they are feeling that fatigue. How do they kind of balance if it's just general fatigue, or maybe there's something bigger going on that in the training picture? Like, what do they do?
It's a great question, because there's just like a lot of like fatigue can come from 1,000 places,
A thousand.
like truly,
Yeah.
and it's just so funny because we're constantly like, no matter what we're talking about, whether it's iron or like perimenopause or like whatever it is, overtraining, like we're constantly trying to like disentangle all of the things, because like whether it's like stress or yeah, fatigue, you're not sleeping, I mean, all these things, gut issues, they could be caused by so many different things. So that really is where we're looking at the whole person. And this is like essentially what I do in one-to-one coaching, right? Or what any dietitian will do, is we're really just doing a lot of digging and detective work to figure out what is going on. So this is where lab work can be really helpful, because we want to, as I discussed before, looking at that complete iron picture to kind of see, okay, what are all these markers, and do you truly have like an iron depletion or iron deficiency, or what is happening there? Right. So is it because of iron, or is something else happening? We can look at inflammation markers. Maybe we're looking at markers for like muscle damage, like creatine kinase, for instance, to see,
Mhm.
okay, well, is it like an overtraining situation? Like, maybe we're looking at hormones, things like cortisol in the early morning and TSH, and seeing if we need to get like a full thyroid panel done to like do. So essentially just looking to see, do we need to dig further in different areas? Maybe we're looking at some low-hanging fruit for me always is like vitamin D and B12, for instance, assessing those things. Red blood cell magnesium is another one that magnesium plays a role in iron metabolism. So we're looking at like all the blood work and doing some detective work there. And then in conjunction with that, we're getting a history from the person. So if you're just thinking about yourself, think, okay, well, what has been going on in my life? Is there like a life event that happened that changed my eating behaviors, that increased stress in my life, that has affected my sleep, that has been explaining why I might be feeling more fatigued? Like, did you just like, get a puppy, or have a kid or something, like literally interrupting your sleep? Or are you not sleeping because of some other thing that's going on, and you just can't sleep? Like, so we're kind of just trying to figure out what is happening. Did maybe something really horrible happened in your life, and that caused maybe it's been harder to eat, and you've been having reduced appetite because of stress and other stuff. So, again, we're trying to assess the whole person from that perspective. Then let's say things are kind of status quo. You're doing your normal job, your family is normal, all the stuff same. Okay, well then let's look at your nutrition as well. Like, are you getting enough in? Are there gaps in your nutrition? Are you eating every 3 to 4 hours? So we're just kind of going through the checklist of all of the things to evaluate the whole person. And then the last thing I'd say, actually two more things. One is like, are these symptoms chronic, or are they acute? Like, did they just happen? Were you totally great and then suddenly you started experiencing these things? Or has the fatigue been chronic? Like, or has it kind of built over time? And then the last thing is like really looking at all the other systems in the body. So, how are your bowel habits? Are you having other GI issues? How's your mood? Do you feel like increases in anxiety? Are you not sleeping well? Do you have your period when you're supposed to? We're essentially looking for signs of underfueling, of chronic underfueling, and REDS, or relative energy deficiency in sport, and really trying to piece together this whole puzzle to explain why you're not feeling like yourself.
Yeah, that's incredible. And it sounds like, just based off of what we were talking about earlier on this episode, that there's just so many different things that can go into play, that having a
Mm-hmm.
partner with you to say, okay, here's your blood work. Let's start to be the detective and let's go
Mm-hmm.
through it and figure this out, because everyone is going to be different. And where that's kind of stemming from is important to make sure that you can get a grasp on it and then create solutions around it to feel better, because ultimately we want to be stronger and faster and have the energy to do all the training and all the running that we want.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Now, can a runner have like a high iron count and a low ferritin count? And
Mm-hmm.
can it be vice versa? So it can be one extreme to the next?
Yeah, so I think, I touched on this briefly, where, we sometimes see iron is either like high normal or even actually high, and
Yeah.
ferritin is low. And that can really be confusing, because you're like, okay, well, aren't I supposed to supplement like with iron because my ferritin's low? And it's like, no, you shouldn't. You don't want to do that, because again, your iron is high and that can be really dangerous. And so what this is kind of indicating is you have iron in your body. And we actually are able to recycle a huge amount of iron in our body. So you're
Mhm.
getting enough iron, you're just not really getting it to where it needs to go. And so what this might mean is maybe there is a lack of certain micronutrients that play important roles in iron metabolism storage. So you're not getting iron into ferritin. And these micronutrients. So there are a number of them that play really important roles. So like copper is one, magnesium, vitamin A, vitamin C, B12. There are a bunch of those that, we need fat and cholesterol to kind of absorb fat soluble vitamins, which points back to vitamin A. There are a lot of things that we need that they all work in conjunction with one another. So
Mhm.
I think sometimes people think, okay, it's all about iron. Like I just need to focus
Yeah.
on iron. It's like actually a lot of these things work together, and you really need to make sure that you're getting variety in the diet, that you're getting not only enough energy into the body, which is like, number one, but also
Yeah.
that you're not just focusing on iron rich foods, which, not everyone is doing, but you're also getting all these other things in. So it can feel very overwhelming to people because they're like, oh my God, this is so much to think about. But this is where it gets back to, hey, like, are you eating like the same exact things every day? Are you eating, fruits and vegetables and other plant foods? Like, what are you getting into your body? And also, is your gut like functioning well, and are you able to actually like, absorb and utilize what you're eating? So that's how like these things kind of come into play.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's so important to have like the right mix. I know as an athlete, when I'm training hard or I'm in a big cycle, like I do kind of resort back to like this is what I'm eating every day because it's
Mm-hmm.
hitting the easy button and I can
Yeah.
make things just a little bit easier to kind of flow through the day, but it is really important to kind of mix it up and create, new fun recipes if you can, or just having access to different types of foods, and fruits and vegetables can do that, pretty easily. We're going to get into that in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit more about training and maybe
Mm-hmm.
some things within training and how it can affect these areas. So, how does a runner who is maybe doing some intense 5K training or some intense training, how does that impact these levels at all versus maybe runner B who's running more aerobically and they're not really pushing workouts or running anything what would be quote unquote hard?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think what's important here is kind of thinking about the overall context for that person, and
Mm-hmm.
like, because someone who's doing more aerobic stuff may still be getting some harder sessions in, right? So I think it depends on the person. But I think for anyone who is training regularly, training hard, because how do we define hard? I mean, hard,
Yeah.
long, like I would almost throw those in the same category. I mean, you are increasing your energy demands. You are increasing the amount of oxygen you're carrying to your muscles. You are increasing the need, or you're losing a little bit more iron. Again, as I mentioned, through like GI and sweat and foot strike. And it's important to kind of keep tabs on all that. So I'd say for both of those people, they're both undergoing stress on their body, and they both have higher energy demands. And we can see that, as I mentioned, in the gut as well. Like we can see some inflammation and some breakdown and some issues there with absorption in both of those instances. So I'm not sure if there's one over the other, and I might be wrong here, so there might be someone else who can chime in and answer this better, but I'm not sure if like there's one over the other. I would say most likely the endurance athlete is the one that's going to be at higher risk because their energy demands are going to be overall higher. But again, it depends.
Yeah.
A 5K runner can be running higher volume. So it really just depends on the person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't do a great job of like giving a good description of both of those
It's all
runners.
good.
Like I'm thinking 5K runner, 5K workouts, long run is like over 10 miles. The
Mm.
mileage is like 25 to 40 miles a week, maybe even higher. And then we have runner B running up to 20 miles a week, casual jogging. They're going to run groups, having fun,
Oh,
social
okay. I
jogging.
misunderstood
Yeah.
the question. Cool, cool, cool. Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Totally. In my mind, it was like 5K runner against marathon runner. I totally
Yeah.
misunderstood. Yeah. No, I mean, I think in that case, obviously the person who is putting in more mileage, more time, more intensity, like that is more demanding on your body, and it's
Yeah.
asking more of your body. And as a result, we kind of need more of all of the things. So that is the one that is going to be at higher risk, most likely, of iron deficiency. Doesn't mean we aren't still like checking the other person, but the person who's kind of putting in more miles, more time, more intensity is the one that we're going to be keep an eye out a little bit more on.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great answer, and I think to go back to, like, the first kind of set of runners that we were talking about, like, if you are in marathon training, it's looking at your mileage and your intensity in training. If you're training for the Boston Marathon and you're running a lot of hills and you're running maybe more quality in your training cycle than you have ever before, maybe you're running more weekly mileage than you have before, those are all, I would say, like, I don't know, yellow flags to look at to make sure that everything is balanced. Before I went into running the Boston Marathon a few years ago, I had blood work done to make sure I was in a good place before going into that training, because it's a different type of training. If you're training to race that distance or that particular race, it's a very different type of training than marathon training. It can be the same, but it can also be different. So
Yeah.
it's good to kind of, yeah, just be aware of where you're at. And I think too, like, something I've noticed is as my mileage has increased over the years and as I've grown as a runner and I've been able to do more, keeping my eyes on all my data and all my biomarkers is even more important as I'm like pushing my body to do more.
Yeah, and then the other thing I'd flag too is like if we're comparing person A who is like in a training cycle and also is like, let's say that person is gradually increasing, or maybe this is a marathon runner we're talking about, but someone's in a training cycle, they're building, they're changing, they're what week over week things are changing, versus another person who isn't necessarily training for anything and they're doing much of the same types of thing. And that's kind of like where I'm at right now, for instance, where I'm just kind of doing the same thing right now. I'm not training for anything. um, sometimes what happens with someone, especially if they're not as experienced or they don't have as much knowledge around nutrition, is like if they're eating the same way that they've always been eating as training increases and they don't
Yeah.
adjust their nutrition to also increase, and they're not increasing their carbs and they're doing all the things to really again adjust as on different training days or in different training phases, that's also where a lot of things can start to drop off and problems can happen. So it's really important to kind of really remember that nutrition, just like training isn't static, nutrition doesn't remain static, and you have to know how to keep adjusting that. And that's one way to really also stay on top of something like iron.
Yeah, that's a really great point. My first marathon training build, my nutrition stayed static and my training increased. And I remember talking to my coach, this was like 3 weeks out from the race, and I'm like, I am just so tired all the time. All the
Yeah.
time. And I said something also about, like, I was a morning runner. I wasn't eating enough for breakfast. And I'm like, and I'm also just hungry all the time. And her solution was very simple. She's like, eat more. You
Yeah.
need to eat more. Like, and I think sometimes whether you're a new runner, you're a first time marathoner, I'm guilty of having this happen too, just in a training cycle where all of a sudden the training kicks up and it catches you off guard a little bit, and you have like a few days and you notice it, and you like start to increase your nutrition. You kind of notice the fatigue, and your body's
Yeah.
not quite where you want it to be.
Yeah, and that's where like performance athlete performance plates just as a visual tool is really, really helpful. I actually have a whole blog on this. I think it's called like how much do I need to eat as an endurance athlete, but it goes through, it's like kind of like a nutrition 101 breakdown, but it goes through all the visual like athlete performance plates on what like an easy day and a moderate day and a hard day, and kind of going through how to adjust what you eat and how to build a balanced plate based on like where you are in a training phase or what kind of training day. So that's just over on my website, eatforendurance.com. And I have actually lots of blog posts and various items that might be helpful if anyone likes reading blogs. But yeah, that's a really helpful tool just because we're on that topic.
Oh, I love that so much, like the performance plates
Mm-hmm.
and the difference between an easy day versus a workout day versus a long run day and the recovery day, which is
Yep.
not as different as you think it's going to be.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Yep.
yeah, it's so so important, and I love that. And it's a great segue for the next little piece to talk about. But what are if an athlete's saying to themselves like, okay, I've had blood work drawn. I know my iron's low. I haven't really put this on like a focal point as much as I should. What are some of maybe the best solutions to help balance out these biomarkers, whether they're low or high. And that could be either in terms of, taking supplements, or if you want to start with food.
Yeah, so I'm definitely like a food first, but not food only dietitian. And I know
Yeah.
many of my colleagues share that philosophy. There's a time and a place for supplements for sure. What we definitely don't want to do, especially with something like iron, given that too much is not good and can be dangerous, is, we don't want to be supplementing forever. So remembering that supplementation should be a temporary thing that we're doing to correct a problem. It shouldn't just be a
Mm,
band-aid we're slapping on and then like forgetting about it. So that's not what we want to do. So we want to understand, like, whenever we like, if you do discover there's an iron issue, you really want to ask yourself why is this happening. And again, there are lots, like, iron is so tricky to treat and figure out. There are lots of reasons why it can be happening. It can be a simple intake issue, but it could also be, I mean, sometimes it's a GI bleed. It can be menstrual losses. I mean, it can be all sorts of different things. It can be, so inadequate intakes we talked about. It could be you're not getting enough of those other supportive nutrients in. There are a lot of issues and things that it could be. So in terms of solutions and where to start, then I think just starting to do some of that detective work that I was describing
yeah.
earlier to kind of figure out why, like, if you're the type of person where you take iron, your ferritin goes up, you stop taking iron, it drops. That could be a really good reason to work with somebody if, like, you can't figure it out on your own and you can't keep it to a good place. But in terms of the food piece, just because, like, yes, we want to make sure you are consuming iron in the diet. That is super important. uh, I'm sure many of the listeners have heard that there are two types of iron. There's heme iron, which is the most easily absorbed form, and it's found in animal-derived foods, while non-heme iron is less bioavailable and is in plant foods, right? They're both great. There's nothing wrong with a plant-based diet. If you're a vegan or vegetarian, you can absolutely get enough iron in the diet. You just have to be a little bit more intentional and thoughtful about it. So, just to list some in the animal category. So things like, actually, one of the highest oysters are actually one of the highest ones, which is, like, I'm not sure how many people are eating oysters or liver. Those are very rich in iron. I personally do not eat either of those things, but they are. So are sardines. But things like beef and chicken, eggs, tuna, turkey, those are all very iron rich. And then for plant foods, lentils are a really wonderful source. Fortified cereals, that's a great way to get it in. Other beans like kidney beans, white beans, pumpkin seeds, tofu, dark leafy greens like spinach we've heard about, although again, it's not very bioavailable. Even something like a peanut butter or cashews. So there are lots of different plant foods that do have iron. The thing that we want to think about is, so there's that. And then we want to think about also absorption. So
Yeah.
when it comes to iron, this is why it's so tricky. I mean, there are many reasons, and we'll get into a few more, but iron is really tricky because certain things inhibit or reduce absorption and certain things increase. So we think about, okay, well, what gets in the way of iron absorption? And so minerals, like zinc and magnesium can block it. So zinc is one reason why we're never recommending chronic zinc supplementations. That's something like in the times of COVID, like, I know my parents were supplementing zinc and a lot of people were supplementing zinc, and that can create, it's a copper antagonist, and copper is really important in iron metabolism. So, like, that can get in the way of things. So yeah, zinc
Oh,
can interfere. Magnesium, a lot of people take magnesium. It may be they're taking it like before bed. So you want to make sure you're not, if you are supplementing iron, that you're taking it nowhere close to a magnesium supplement. Something like calcium can get in the way of absorption. So we always think of, like, if you're putting, milk in your coffee, or if you're having yogurt at breakfast, or, whatever's going on. And of course, we can talk about timing of supplementation too. But so calcium's one. Tannins. So tannins found in tea and coffee. So again, like, many people take a supplement in the morning, and that can be an issue. And then the last one is phytate. So that's found in some whole grains and legumes, but cooking that actually reduces that problem. So I wouldn't really stress too much about that. And then in terms of what increases absorption, I'm sure many people have heard vitamin C is the big one. We want to have vitamin C with our plant foods, food sources of iron. And, that's something like citrus, strawberries, some dark leafy greens, that kind of stuff. And you don't need much. It's like 50 milligrams, and you can get that from like a half a cup of strawberries or broccoli or a quarter cup of red pepper or something like that. So you don't need a whole lot. Half a glass of OJ would do the trick. And that will help increase absorption there. And then, yeah, the other thing I will mention, just because I have mentioned a few times the different micronutrients that play a role in iron metabolism. So just to kind of expand upon that, so copper is something that in the bioavailable form, it's part of something called ceruloplasmin. You can actually test for that in the blood if anyone's curious, but it's responsible or helpful in moving iron into the storage form, so into ferritin. So we need copper, bioavailable copper, to move iron into ferritin. So if we don't have enough copper, then that can sometimes be a part of the problem. And we can get that from a variety of foods. Vitamin A in its active form, retinol, is very important also in iron metabolism. I mentioned magnesium, vitamin C, which hopefully you're getting a lot in because it's in fruits and veggies and you want to have it, and vitamin D, and then B12. B12 is a really important one because if it's inadequate, that slows down red blood cell production, and that can eventually affect iron status. So it's not to get too technical or complicated, but there are just a lot of different things involved. And zinc. That's the other one. So, even though I mentioned some of these same things are the ones that like interfere with absorption, they're also involved in the process of iron metabolism. So yeah, it can get a little tricky.
Yeah, and you mentioned timing of
Timing, yes,
yes.
yeah.
Can you talk more about that? Like, what's the best timing if
Mm-hmm.
someone is taking supplements and basing it around their daily diet?
Absolutely, yeah. So that's another tricky one with people. So the general advice that you'll hear a lot is to take a supplement, like an iron supplement, on an empty stomach, in part because of all these different things that can interfere. And usually we're recommending it in the morning because your body is more receptive to absorbing it. And then supplementing every other day may also be useful, not every single day, so every other day. And this primarily has to do with a hormone called hepcidin, and that really controls how much iron is available for things like making hemoglobin and red blood cells. And it can reduce or increase iron absorption to make sure that your body cells are not experiencing iron overload. So it's just kind of this regulatory thing that's making sure that we're not getting too much iron when we don't want that. So essentially, hepcidin increases later in the day, and which means iron absorption goes down. And also, if you take an iron supplement, the body kind of regulates by increasing hepcidin levels for 24 hours. So again, when I say it's tricky, it's really tricky. So that's why we say, okay, you might want to take it in the morning on an empty stomach, every other day potentially, to be more effective. But it's also one of these things where, okay, can you tolerate iron on an empty stomach? So this is where like the type of iron you're taking, we want to keep in mind. So ferrous sulfate, which is one form, some people may experience, and of course, depending on what the dose is, you might experience nausea or constipation or certain issues. There are other forms like ferrous bisglycinate. It's a gentler form. It's a little bit lower in elemental iron in that ferrous sulfate. And then there are other forms as well, like that have, it's not to get too in the weeds with it, but depending on what kind of supplement you use, and there are various kinds that are a little gentler on the stomach. And then if you're having it with food or not, you may or may not tolerate it well. And then also, does your body respond? So there are a lot of factors to kind of keep in mind here, which is why if you're really struggling, this is why it can be really helpful to work with a professional, whether it's with your doctor or with a sports dietitian or whoever it is, to really dial this part in.
Absolutely, because it is pretty complicated and there's a lot of moving parts to make sure that it's as successful as we want it to be. For an athlete who might want to try to do this on their own and see like what they can discover and change about their panels, how long should a runner work on this before deciding to maybe partner with a dietitian? Like, what's kind of like the best practice with time?
Yeah. So, I mean, keep in mind. So yeah. So supplementation, like when you get lab work done, because no one should ever be supplementing iron without lab work. That's not a safe practice. So let's say you get lab work done. most likely your doctor will say something, but I mean, I love physicians, but they're also overworked and they don't have a lot of time to spend on things. So they might just be like, take an iron supplement and not really, and that's all you get. So let's say like, you have a true anemia, then yes, 1,000% you would want to take an iron supplement, or even an iron depletion. Maybe your hematocrit and hemoglobin aren't low. So you might want to take an iron supplement while in conjunction working on foods, right?
Mhm.
So, I mentioned a lot of different, foods that you can include, and you're thinking about those other micronutrients and you're making sure that you're getting enough in. So while you're working on that, I mean, it takes time for obviously the
Yeah.
body to, like, you don't want to like start supplementing and then retest a month later and then that's it. Like, give yourself like a couple months at least, to kind of see how things are going, track your symptoms, track how things are going. If you are so depleted, like your ferritin is in the tank, like single digits or even low double digits, and you're like in the midst of a really big training cycle, I would really like second guess that. I would really
Mhm.
just be careful because there are some risks involved with training when, well, first of all, it would be miserable. So I think just really you might want to reassess like what your goals are and what what you're trying to do, and you might at least want to consider pulling back for a little while to allow your body to really like heal and recuperate and really focus on replenishing your stores, and so that you can feel better and perform better. um but yeah, I would say like if you're really determined to do it yourself, and
Yeah.
especially if you have the care of a doctor or you have a little bit of support from a doctor, then yeah, give it like, a couple months and see if you're seeing improvements. And if you're really not, or you're not feeling better, or you're just so overwhelmed and confused, then yeah, that's when I maybe you want to reach out. Or there are lots of courses and things you can do. Like, you don't necessarily have to invest in a dietitian. Many dietitians, offer a masterclass or various things. Like, there are many ways to learn more about this,
Yeah.
if depending on what your budget is.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on a great point, like the risk of training with these areas so low. So what else? I mean, I know the feeling of feeling like garbage in a workout, in a training cycle. I've kind of been there. I tapped one foot on that side and then, tried to come back. And did come back. But like, what are some other risks for runners who, maybe they don't know that these levels are low. Maybe they feel like garbage and they're just not getting their blood work drawn, or they're getting the blood work back and life's busy. They have a marathon to run and they're determined to do it.
I mean, there are risks like, hey, you could like faint or something. Like, it can be that kind of
Yeah.
risk, right? That could be a
Yeah.
risk. You can, I mean, I think the main issue is that you're just going to feel so terrible. Like, what are you actually going to be able to accomplish?
Yeah.
You know, and you're just kind of digging yourself further into a hole. So if you just kind of get results and then you're not doing anything about it, not only are you going to keep feeling bad or get worse. Like, let's say you aren't really, you're just like, oh, my ferritin's low, but I'm functioning just fine. Like, I can get through my workouts, and yeah, I'm a little tired during the day, but I'm fine. Like, you're probably on like a slippery slope down.
Yeah.
So rather than waiting until you've hit like rock bottom, like, let's start taking some steps now to kind of figure this out and help make it better. Because most likely you're not just like training for an event just to do the event. You probably have goals, like whether it's a certain time or at least to have fun. Again, you're not going to have fun if you're feeling horrible and you can't even like complete workouts. Or like, often what I see is, you can finish your workout, but then you can't actually do anything with the rest of your day. And like, you have other responsibilities, you have to work, you
Yeah.
have to take care of family, like whatever it is. So, I really want, when I'm working with people, I want to support them in all areas of their life. So when I say performance, I'm not just talking about athletic performance. I'm like performance as a human being. I want you to
Yeah.
feel good as a human. You are a human. You're not just an athlete. So yeah, I wouldn't put off working on this stuff. I'd really prioritize it. And it might be like, often when it comes to iron, it's the tip of the iceberg. You're often, usually when we find an iron problem,
Yeah.
it's not like, oh, that's the only thing going on, that's it, you're good. It's like, ooh, that's one amongst like a lot of things I see that we need to work on. And maybe you are underfueling, or maybe you do have some other issues we can work on. So, yeah, I really encourage people to kind of do a little bit of digging, even if it's just like on your own. Like, I have a free I have a lot of free nutrition downloads on my website, eatforendurance.com, where, one is like a food journal exercise where it kind of just like gives you prompts to write down a descriptive journal. We're not calorie counting, but just a descriptive journal and seeing the
Yeah.
context. Cause I'm always talking about context about like, okay, like where does exercise fit in? What's the timing of all these things and what's going on? And then I ask kind of, again, more prompts about like how people are feeling. And it's obviously not a substitute for like a one-to-one coaching session, but it can just get the wheels going and thinking about like, ooh, I noticed that I didn't eat for 6 hours here. That's interesting. I wonder why. And ooh, I noticed that I really didn't eat that much in the first part of the day. And that's probably why I was starving at 8 p.m. or whatever it may be. Right. So I think just looking for patterns and just opening your eyes to things, a lot of times people are just really not aware because they have so much stuff going on. So if you just take the time to just stop, jot things down, see what's going on. A lot of times you can do some pretty basic stuff on your own just to get the wheels going.
Yeah, and maybe address some low-hanging fruit and then
Yeah,
partner with you.
absolutely.
Yeah, another sports dietitian, whomever, to help support them
Totally.
and get them to a really, really good spot. When it comes, I'm going to circle back to food for just a moment. When it
Yeah.
comes back to like supplementing or getting enough iron in a diet, what would
Hmm.
be like your daily recommendation in terms of like a breakfast, lunch, dinner kind of scenario?
Yeah. So just kind of if we look at what like the like so we look at like daily requirements. So that's usually
Yeah.
how I think about it is like, okay, well, how much do you need per day? And just to throw some numbers out there, which I mean, no one's really going to know what this means in food, but just so you can know, for men, it's 8 milligrams per day. And for premenopausal women, it's 18 milligrams. So you can see just how much more women need compared to men. And that's a really good thing just to note. Um, I don't have the amounts memorized in my head for like how much to get to that exact amount, but I would say that if at your various meals, much like when we work with macronutrients, like when we're being like, cool, do I have a good source of this and that, and do I have a good source of protein, do I have a good source of carbs and fat, and you're kind of going through that checklist.
Yeah.
If you are making sure at each meal, because iron is often found in a lot of protein foods, not always, but in many, for plants and animals. And so if you're like looking at, hey, do I have a good protein on my plate, and then thinking, and does that provide iron? So I listed on there, certain fish like eggs, beef, turkey, chicken. Like,
Yeah.
so if you are making a meal of some kind and you have one of those things as a protein source, you are getting some iron in there. So that's a really, like, if we're just talking broad strokes and not getting to the weeds
Yeah.
of numbers, that's a good way of thinking about it. And then if you're more plant-based and thinking, and or maybe you're also combining, because I love the strategy of like combining plant-based proteins with animal proteins if you happen to eat all the things, but maybe you want to reduce how much meat or other animal foods you're including. So maybe instead of
Yeah.
like 6 ounces of chicken, you're doing 3 ounces, but you're including a bunch of whole grains and lentils and to kind of make up the difference, and nuts and seeds and stuff like that. So like thinking also, so if you are plant-based, okay, like, do I have lentils, do I have beans, like, do I have these other things on my plate that are providing something? So I think just thinking back to, what are some iron rich foods? Like maybe we're looking at the leafy greens. So if you're eating something like spinach or kale, am I having citrus? Can I maybe saute some red bell pepper, or yellow bell pepper, or whatever in there, or some other vitamin C source? Maybe I'm having some strawberries or an orange or whatever with it. So you're just
Yeah.
kind of thinking of these combos. Like I think about a soup I often make that's like a chicken rice soup that has lemon and spinach in it as well. So it's like, again, you're thinking of these food combinations, what increases absorption. We talked about vitamin C. And so you can kind of just, when you're putting these meals together in your head, just do some really like basic checklist type things, which is exactly what we
Yes.
do with other nutrients. Because if you're looking at your plate and you have, say, a salad with chicken, that's not a complete meal. Like we're missing the carbs. So it's like along those lines, you're just tagging on, okay, cool. And what about iron? Now, I mentioned all those other micronutrients. That's where things can get a little bit more complex. But, again, you can even just Google, like, what are sources of copper? What are sources of magnesium? And there are a lot of, like, with magnesium, for instance, there's a lot of plant foods, whether it's like nuts or seeds or whatever. So you can kind of just go through those different things and and just see, hey, can I just include a greater variety of foods? Most likely going to be getting in a lot of these nutrients if you're including variety, if you're including different plant foods, and if you're using kind of this checklist style of building a meal.
Yeah, that's a really great recommendation. It's like rewiring the brain a little bit. Like you said, we do kind of check the protein, the carbohydrate, the fat. Let's just add on to that a little bit
Hmm.
and make sure that our performance plate, our performance bowls really are that. They are performance based and we can go out there and do everything that we love to do. I have one more quick question. Make it
Yeah.
quick. I don't know. Now, for you had mentioned iron and ferritin levels, they're going to be higher for the endurance runner. Do they need to be even higher for maybe an athlete who is at altitude or
Hmm.
an athlete who might be menstruating?
Hmm.
Any of those varieties? Like, do we need to go a little bit higher there?
Yeah, so for altitude, yes, because as I mentioned, like I'd said, at least 40 to 50 for ferritin, and at altitude, like possibly even higher. And that's
Yeah.
because you have higher iron needs at altitude. So the body has an increased demand for oxygen, and that stimulates the production of red blood cells, and that requires more iron to make hemoglobin. So essentially, you need more iron. So yeah, we
Yeah.
definitely want to be on top of your iron if you're at altitude, and especially if you are an endurance athlete or an active person at altitude, you want to keep an eye on that. So if you have a tendency, let's say you're going to altitude to train, or you move to altitude, or you're just living at altitude and you know you have a history of low iron, low ferritin, then yeah, that's something we really want to keep tabs on. In terms of menstruation, yeah, absolutely. Like obviously women are losing blood every month, and how much really depends on you and your cycle, and that can change over time. So I think
Yeah.
just kind of keeping tabs on that and how heavy your cycle is, and paying attention to what your levels are, again testing regularly at least once, maybe twice a year. But yeah, women, as I mentioned, they need 18 milligrams instead of 8. So we definitely need more iron as menstruating women, as female athletes. So all the more reason to really stay on top of your iron intake, and again, getting that variety in your diet to make sure you're covering your bases for the micronutrients.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to talk about for today? And I know there's a lot here.
I know. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. I mean, the only thing I think I didn't mention is like, we talked a lot about like intensity and increased mileage. And the one thing I'd say is sometimes appetite can get thrown off, or even like just with
Mm,
altitude. I know when
yeah,
I'm very sensitive to altitude. Anytime at altitude, my appetite tanks. And that can really be hard when you're trying to get enough food into your body and of all the things. And so,
yeah,
working on strategies there and knowing that as an athlete, especially as an endurance athlete, we're not necessarily, we don't want to just eat when we're hungry and stop when we're full. There are times where we really just have to eat more thoughtfully and strategically. And then, being aware of like what strategies work for you, and whether it's like liquid nutrition or whatever else it is to kind of get those things in, having some go to snacks and easy foods, easy meals that you can tolerate. Yeah, I'd say that's one other thing that we want to keep in mind.
absolutely. That's all great advice. Claire, thank you so much for your time today. Where can our audience find you online?
Yeah, you can find me at eatforendurance.com is my website. My podcast is the Eat for Endurance podcast. I have a YouTube channel. I'm on Apple and Spotify and all the places. And I'm mostly active on Instagram, and I am Eat for Endurance there.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much for your time. Have a great week.
Thank you for having me. You too.